Here's a question. When you do you switch up which hand you do shift with? Like when you're doing shift, like do you do like the right shift to do things with your left hand and the left shift to do letters with your right hand?
No, I never hit the right shift.
Me either.
How do you hit like capital A then?
With my pinky and my ring finger on my left hand.
Yeah, you screw up the home row and shift your whole hand to the left. The right shift on my keyboard might as well not exist.
Yeah, I agree. I never hit anything below the enter key on my right hand.
I mean, if you found yourself in the weird position of not having certain keys, that would come in very handy.
Do you have a left shift?
I have 2 shift keys, but now that I'm thinking of them, one of those sounds a little redundant.
Yeah, the right one.
I could, well, no, I can't. I have to be careful what I assign to things, right? Because in Guild Wars, I'm only using my left hand, and I need to be able to go the number row and then shift up to the F row.
Yeah, your left hand has the shift. Your right one is literally never used.
No, but I mean, I can't change it around, and I can't change to use right shift as my layer shift because my right hand is not on the keyboard when I'm playing Guild Wars.
Yeah, so use that shift for something else, like F2.
Yeah, don't you need like 19 shifts on your keyboard because you only have 7 keys?
Okay, first of all, I have 60 keys. Right now I use caps lock. If I tap caps lock, it's caps lock. And if I hold caps lock, it's shift to the other layer.
How long is a hold?
I don't know. I never tuned it quite that much.
Does the keyboard firmware do that, or does the OS do it?
I think it's actually the keyboard firmware, because I have to, if I change it, I actually have to almost flash the new firmware to like a new setting profile thing to my keyboard using a special program.
Cool.
So I think the keyboard is sending, F1 signal, whatever it is. But the keyboard itself is looking, okay, he's holding down caps lock and hitting the 1 key. So I have to map it.
Nice.
Welcome back to another episode. I'm Jason.
I'm Chris.
And I'm Mario. And this is Super Quit.
So I was on Reddit, as I do, and something popped up on my feed that had a pretty fiery... Actually, you know what? It didn't have a fiery debate in the comments, and that's what bothered me about it. The question that was kind of posed, I don't remember which specific subreddit it was, but the question was posed on, do developers at your company have production database access? And it didn't specify whether it was read or write or both or, any of those things. But it just kind of said, hey, is this a thing your company does? Is this a thing that should be done? And the comments were overwhelmingly in favor of never giving developer access to production databases. And I just found that too black and white. And I thought it was a good conversation topic to kind of talk about, just because I don't think it's that black and white.
Yeah, I think in the ideal world, maybe developers wouldn't need production database access. But I feel like there are enough edge cases and little one-off remediations and investigations and stuff where inevitably someone is going to come to a developer and say, hey, can you look up XYZ in the database?
I think there's a difference between, what's the definition of developer, right? Is it the person that is writing the app, or is it the DBA, right? Somebody has to have access to the production database to be able to maintain it, patch it, back it up, do whatever they have to do. But does that person should that be the same person who writes the app that runs against that database, or should it be separated as kind of a separation of concerns?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things here is, there's a difference between having access to it and caring about the content of it. A DBA arguably would care more about the schema and the way that it is designed and the way that it is maintained than the actual content within it. Whereas I feel like a developer, at least in my case, would use the production access to run queries, whether that be for testing or for investigation or for straight up business reports if you only have a production database. Whereas a DBA would, in my mind, just that wouldn't be part of their normal kind of course of action. I'm on the side that I think it largely depends on both the content of the data and the size of the business or the size of the project or app or whatever. I don't know that I agree, Mario, that that's an ideal world where they don't have access. I think an ideal world where they don't have write access ever is probably ideal world for me, but I don't know. And unless you have some really sophisticated like replication and analytics databases, which again, you're getting to a larger sized project and a larger sized team and all of that. I can't see a case where you would never want someone to have kind of read access to a production database.
The only thing that I'm kind of concerned about giving everybody read access to a production database isn't so much the sort of privacy aspect or the data security aspect, because I feel like maybe a database, you need to be cognizant of what you store in a database already. My concern is more about a rogue query impacting production performance.
Yeah, that's what a lot of people in the Reddit comment section had to say that I guess I didn't really think about too much, is that a bad join can really hamper a production database, even though it's a read, it's a select. It can also be easily killed is the other side of it. Like you could also easily go to a no lock scenario with or requiring no lock from certain people. I do agree with you on the security aspect though. Like if your data's at rest, it shouldn't be in a and it needs to be secure in some way. It shouldn't be human readable just by a simple select query. But I guess I kind of see the performance risks, but they don't seem large enough to me, at least in the size of a company that I've worked with, to outweigh the benefits that you get from at least a few select people having read access and then, almost no one having write access.
That might be a good way to think about it and break it down when you said a small company, which then the comparison comes in versus a medium company and a large company, and I guess maybe a large software team and a one-off sort of single developer project. If you are the lone developer on some little side project, you are admin, support, everything, right? You have all of the access. But meanwhile, if you are a massive organization, you're going to have dedicated DBAs. You might have something like Flyway, where you could script out and automate any changes to the schema. I would think in that case, you would also be offloading. You would be separating your data from operational data store, like a database, versus something analytical, like a data lake that is purpose built for reports and analysis. So I feel like maybe between those two extremes, it's a question of when do we change, when do we implement new practices and new sort of categories.
I think that's the key thing for me, is if you have a replicated non-production operational database. I know it's a lot of,
qualifiers. Yeah.
A lot of qualifiers there. But if you have a non-production, non-operational, fully replicated database to hit that everyone can kind of use as their place to run their queries or their reports or their or their debugging, right? If it's replicated and it's, you're almost in a blue-green environment maybe, or, a failover kind of case where you're, transactionally replicated, that's ideal for me. I would much rather hit that secondary database than the primary, as long as I can trust and the system has been set up such that I know that what I'm hitting there is the same as what I would hit if I was, on the production database. I think that for me is kind of ideal case. I do agree that people shouldn't have write access to production databases, particularly for the for the applications I've worked with, which are just giant SQL state machines in a in a database where changing one thing can bring down the whole system. That has been that has led to a few failures at my company in the past. So I get that restriction.
I think my question would be, what are you trying to get out of this access to this production database? Right. So, and also I think it depends on what the use of the database is, right? I've worked on some apps where you had a database as a convenient way to be kind of an off machine data store and just, use a relational database just because it's convenient. But maybe that doesn't have to be the way that it's stored. You could have stored it as a local file, or you could have worked with it, whatever. And in that case, it's like, yeah, I want to be able to get in there and even have write access, right? Because that's my configuration and it's my, my system of record. And granted, what I'm talking about is not really like business transactions, and it's not a high throughput kind of situation. It's much more of a, hey, I just needed somewhere to store my data for my app. And I could have probably used SQLite, but I decided to use a SQL Server just because it was there and it was convenient. And in that case, yeah, it totally makes sense. But I feel like once you get to the point where that database is in operation, like if that's part of your business and part of your day-to-day, there's a couple questions. One of them is the data integrity, like the data sensitivity question in terms of like, does this have anything that you should be concerned about people running arbitrary queries about? And the other is like, why can't you take the time to write a reviewed and kind of well-known access point to that data? Like you could write a stored procedure, you could write a view, you could write, a little thing in your app, a screen that could show these things. And then you would know that there would be, okay, I can inventory all the different ways that somebody can get at this data if I have these, known pathways. So I think I would push back a little bit and say, I see why you might want to do that. And I could say it makes sense if you have the resources to do it, to try to get to the point where you don't have developers that have access to the production data.
I think that's a great point. And that's actually something that we have started to do a tiny bit at my place, is to write those stored procedures for reports that we would normally want to run. And then you as a developer would have production access, but you may not have production access to run a straight up select query. You may have only production access to run certain stored procedures that you've been pre-approved for, essentially. We know that they're not going to lock the system. We know that they're safe queries. We know, given a certain set of input, that they'll run in a reasonable amount of time. Those things. We also have a lot of locks on or a lot of safeguards on our database now, or some of our databases, where if queries run too long and they're user initiated, they're automatically terminated. So yeah, I think we've gotten into a really nice happy medium, which is why this question sparked so much fire in my stomach, because the prevailing Reddit theory, right, the collective hive mind of Reddit, was that this shouldn't be allowed. But I think there are safe ways to do it, and I think we've found the happy medium in the stored procedures and the killing things that are long running.
Sorry, did you say the popular opinion on this Reddit thread was that it should be allowed or shouldn't?
Shouldn't under any circumstances. Like ideal scenario, you would not give any access to production databases. The only thing with access would be the application itself.
I would push back and say that the stored procedures you were just describing are an app in themselves, and the fact that you run them through a connection to the database is just semantics, because you're saying, okay, it still has to be a known, committed. I mean, database version management is tricky, but it has to be reviewed code that is accessing this thing, and you can only get at it in this one way. The fact that somebody didn't go to the effort of writing an app to do that access is, to me, not that much different if you're only allowed to run stored procedures.
That's a really cool way of thinking about it. Yeah, I like that.
I do not know much about databases. Is that a thing you could do? Give people just permission to run a certain stored procedures?
Database permissions, well, particularly I'm familiar with Microsoft SQL servers, is really fine tunable, like down to the individual, stored procedure that you want to give access to. What they're allowed. Are they allowed to run selects? Are they allowed to run updates? Are they allowed to hit certain tables? Are they allowed to, I think I've never done it, but I'm pretty sure you can get down to the field level within tables as well.
No, that'd be scary. So it sounds like it kind of comes down to whatever access you need to do your job, you should have, but it should be given in a safe way so that there are protections against human error or bad actors or something.
Yeah, that sounds ideal, but I don't know that that's practical. There's always this trade-off between security and what I'll call safety of, the system or just safety of keeping it alive and keeping it running. And I don't know that safety is the right word, but
stability.
Stability. There you go. There's always that trade-off with the security, stability, and convenience, right? And I think, in an ideal world, yeah, maybe you're right, Mario, that like you would be able to fine tune these permissions so perfectly and update them so regularly and so precisely that it would work. So, but that doesn't happen where I am.
But we could agree that like permissions to modify tables and administrate the database, permission to write to the database, that's a pretty tightly controlled access.
At least in production, yeah.
Yeah.
How do you guys manage dev databases? And I guess really what I'm kind of interested in here is shared databases, right? Multi-user, not one that's kind of that you alone kind of control. But, do you allow, or in an ideal world, would you allow developer access to write new tables or, do whatever they need to do to implement a feature? Do you guys have DBAs? Do you want a DBA? Like, how does that work for you?
For me, I would say I don't do enough with databases to probably have a coherent opinion on this. But in the past, when I've worked with databases, it's been on very small projects and it's been with a couple of people. So it's basically you put one person as the person in charge of the database and the other person as the person in charge of the app, or, keep that line of delineation, and then only one person has to keep the mental model of the database in their head and, make the changes and worry about the conflicts and things like that. But I guess in a perfect world, it would be nice to have a DBA, but then again, all of the enterprise interactions that I've had with DBAs feels like it slows things down a lot. So it doesn't strike me as worth it in a lot of the things, at least at the scale that I work, which is very small, because we have a very, niche piece of the world. And so we're not doing something that's supporting thousands of users and all of that. So for us, it's like, yeah, having to schedule a change window and do all this stuff for modifying the database is just too much overhead to make it worth it.
We don't have a DBA. There's no dedicated person that owns the database's design and then implementation of new things. I sometimes wish we did, just because our database schema could probably be improved. It's kind of overly simplistic, perhaps. And I think if there was someone who we could sort of identify as the custodian for that model, we'd probably be in a slightly better place. As far as your original question, to like who can modify the dev database, we actually keep our dev database as locked down as our prod one, as far as modification. I don't know if that's required, but I do know that our team is large enough and enough people depend on the stability of that. It's the non-prod database that if it were modified in such a way that it diverges from production, then it's no longer trustworthy, and so many aspects of the development process are going to be impacted by that. I think people assume that if something works in dev, it needs to work in prod as well. And I think if you started to shake that confidence, specifically as to like what fields are available in the database and what is happening on that side. That's a very core thing that we just don't want to touch.
I have so many follow-up questions.
Okay, go ahead.
First of all, do you only have two environments, dev and prod?
As it concerns databases?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so it's not like you have a dev and then like a staging or a QA and then prod.
Not for databases, no.
Okay, so your QA environment hits your dev database?
Yes, all of our non-prod environments hit the same non-prod database.
So then if you do need a change to this dev database, what does that process look like? Like, how does that work as a team?
They are infrequent enough that we don't really have a well-defined process at all. There is a person who is on the leadership team. They own the credentials to that database. They are the one with administrative access, and if you need to add a field or change something, they are the one you talk to. I think we could probably improve that in some ways, but as it is, that's kind of all it is.
Does that mean that you, like, if you're testing something or like a test scenario or whatever, that all of it has to be written in an application? You can't like insert test data with a SQL viewer or a SQL, tool or anything like that to your test database?
I don't think many people have, right? I think some people probably do because these things are just doled out on an individual basis. I will say that our system is so tightly coupled in some ways to external platforms that modifying our database is really not the way to go about it. You have to modify those external systems, and then our application, by its nature, will replicate those changes and update our database as required.
Gotcha. I mean, I guess the last assumption here, or the thing to make clear to maybe everyone listening, is you are in an environment where almost everything is API driven, right? Like,
it is extremely API driven.
Yeah, there's very few people actually touching the database itself, other than probably the people implementing the specific API. Whereas in my business, like, we're writing SQL selects and SQL updates straight into code at the application level, at the all the way kind of up the chain. Very not as API driven of an environment.
So what do you mean by that? You mean you have the database, or maybe multiple databases, but you have many different applications and layers of that application touching the same database.
Yeah. We're I wouldn't call it a monolith or whatever you want to put on a non-microservice. But it's bigger than a microservice, and there's a lot of database, like direct database access happening in that application, and in few applications. Like, our design isn't as, as a company we're not as strict on everything has to be communicated via APIs. We're trying to get there, and we're getting closer, because it is really the right way to do it. But it requires more people, right? It requires someone to maintain the way that you access data. And we're also in an environment where our databases are changing, not constantly, but regularly.
Yeah, the nature of our systems is such that a database is only touched by one application, by one program running. Anything else that needs that data or some usage of that data, it's going to go through the REST API that the application exposes.
I feel very out of place here because I don't have a database that I work with on a daily basis. So I really don't have a lot to contribute on the database front, but I have worked with databases in the past, but just not much recently and not at scale.
Has it always been, I'll call it Wild West because I don't have a better term, but in your environment, Chris, has it always been anyone can do anything because the applications are small enough? And has it ever bitten you? Like, has it ever come to where it's like, oh, what did you do? You broke the table, you changed the schema, now we have to go fix it in 100 different, like, has that horror story ever happened?
It happens in small ways, I would say. Like, it's something where, oh, you changed the table, now you have to go put it back. But we haven't, but maybe twice, I think, gotten to a point where we had to go restore from backups, which we did actually have to do. But then again, we're not talking about systems that have transactions coming through hundreds per second or anything like that, right? It's only if this application is being run, is there anything going on with that? And when you break it while you're developing this application, you're basically by definition not running it. And therefore, you can really take the whole thing down and fix it. So it has been, Wild West, as you say, or at least, small, bespoke, databasing.
Bespoke databases. I feel like there's one of those jokes like it's only SQL if it comes from the SQL region of France. I do think that in the same way that we have automation around environments and deployments and tests and all of that, infrastructure, I think similar technologies exist. I know similar technologies exist for database configuration. I think they are very far down the list of priorities for most teams. So scripts that allow you to just implement database updates as code, right? Like Flyway is the only one that I really have experience with. I think they work really well, but databases change so infrequently in my field, in my experience at least, that it's never deemed worth it to implement those.
Yeah, I would say you're describing the idea of CI/CD for databases kind of in my mind. That's automating changes, schema changes, table, things like that, adding fields.
Yeah, kind of in the same way that we have infrastructure as code, maybe databases as code.
Yeah, I would say that topic has hit our company a couple times, and every time it's like, oh yeah, that's a great idea, and then it just never happens.
Exactly,
because you're right. It doesn't tend to be something that when there are database changes, there's tend to be like a lot of them all at once, and then there are none for whatever the period of time is, and that's kind of how we experience it.
Same.
Where it's like, oh man, we got to add like 4 tables and like 7 fields to existing tables to implement this one feature. But the frequency in which you need to do that is every 3 months, every 6 months, whatever it is. So the topic doesn't it's not like code changes that like every single thing you do needs to be kind of put out there. So it just never holds that traction.
Yeah, it's really hard to justify putting the effort forward when the reward is not all that great.
I don't know why the database vendors haven't made this. I know there's a bunch of third parties that do these for different, Microsoft SQL or MySQL or Postgres or whatever. But I don't understand why one of them hasn't said, and we've built in this really great version control thing. I know that Microsoft kind of has that with Entity Framework, but you have to kind of use their tools to do it and use Entity Framework to do an ORM, and there's pluses and minuses to using object relational mappers, that people may or may not want to get into. But I'm surprised that there's not the idea of hey, I'm a DBA, or I'm the person editing the schema of the database now, begin a transaction of that, and then write me out, I'm going to work with it in my graphical way, or I'm going to work with it over the course of several queries. And when I'm done, generate me the schema, the DDL basically, to change the database so that I can use that as a patchable diff. And maybe there is, and I'm just totally unfamiliar. But at least when I was looking into it probably 8 years ago, I didn't see anything other than getting it from a third party that you could do to do these things. And I wished it had been built in, because I trust it more if it comes from the people that are actually writing the thing, that they're probably not going to break it as they iterate and go up in version.
I agree. Every time we've looked into this, it has been a third party as well, some kind of tooling or something else. But that'd be really nice if it was first party, just built into Microsoft SQL Server. That's a really interesting point. I guess this entire time in my mind, I have been thinking about this as a relational database. But does the conversation change? I mean, non-relational databases don't have schemas, do they? Or they don't have enforced schemas?
I mean, I think the better question, the better statement is, I have not worked with many non-relational databases except for Dynamo, and that doesn't dole out access rights in the same way. It uses IAM permissions, right? So it's like, who do you want to have query permissions? Who do you want to have scan permissions? Who could insert, etc. So it gets to be a little different. But I would imagine that most NoSQL databases have some idea of, they have some concept of a permission. So, I've worked with Mongo. I try to block that one out.
I've worked with Mongo once. I did it as a side project because I wanted to learn a NoSQL database. And it was kind of cool. I was like, oh yeah, I put these little JSON records in this thing and then I can query out whatever I want and it just figures it out. But I have no idea how it works under the hood.
All right, so here's the question of the day. What's the difference between a database and a data warehouse?
Well, that's all the time we've got today. If you want to find anything out about our show, you can visit us at superquit.libsyn.com. And if you have any feedback, you can drop us a line.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll talk to you next time.
Quick plug for AWS DynamoDB, which does allow you to configure indices and all kinds of other fun things. Just, with your regular CloudFormation scripts.
Use referral code XQZ3 lowercase j uppercase Q -7M.
You're really committing to this joke, aren't you?
Yeah, well, I was just imagining.
He wasn't done.
If you're trying to give I'm not done. But if you're trying to give a promo code that is a GUID because you didn't have a real sponsorship, so you didn't have a real link, it would just be the most obnoxious podcast ad ever.
What's your website? Oh, well, we didn't want to spend much money on the website, so we just used the uuid.com.
It will not be in the show notes. You have to type it in manually.
It's like when you call. Have you ever called Microsoft to have to activate Windows? Had to call them on the phone.
Oh, you got to read the CD key.
Oh my gosh!
them?
It gives you the 40 character thing that you have to read to them, and they plug it in on their end, and then they read you back a 25 character thing that you have to type in on your end in order to activate your CD key. It is the worst. Although I will say that somewhere around the end of Windows 7, beginning of Windows 10, they switched to a completely automated system that can just understand. So you're talking to a computer, which is a little bit nicer because you don't feel like you're wasting somebody else's time. You feel like they're wasting your time, but at least you are not wasting somebody else's time.
You should care less.
Actually, what they did was now that I remember, they made it so that the thing you have to give them is all numbers and the thing they give you back is all letters. And so you can type it in on your phone, which made it even faster.
That's nice.
You could dial it in on your touchtone phone.
Are you still doing this regularly, Chris?
No, I haven't done it in a while, but I remember doing it several times when I was in high school because I was reinstalling my OS every 6 months because I guess I don't know why.
Quick plug for Debian Linux. There's no licenses to activate.
If we ever...
Do you have a promo code for that?
I do. My promo code is 14FH. Wait, H isn't a valid. This joke doesn't work.
So close.
H is not a valid hex code. This is a base 17 UUID.
That's base 18 actually for H.
Damn it.
If hex, which is 16, gets to F, then G would be 17 and H would be 18.
I get it. Thank you. I like making jokes about alternate bases.